Welcome back to the Print 3D channel and the first episode of Cinema 4D for 3D printing. On this episode, we're going to cover the basics, so let's get started. Thank you for joining me on Cinema 4D for 3D printing. This first episode will cover the basics of setting up your scene, checking your project scale, going over the interface and some of the tools, and getting us started with our very first model. So let's head over to Cinema 4D and get started. So here we are in Cinema 4D. The version I am currently using is R16. There is a newer version available if you are looking to purchase this application. Or if you have an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, you have access to After Effects, which gives you access to Cinema 4D Lite, built into the host application of After Effects. You have limited capabilities, but it's still a great modeling tool. Before we begin, there are a few things to consider when building 3D printable objects and models in Cinema 4D. Firstly, you can't use any textures created in the materials. If we create a quick default material and add a bump layer, add some noise and crank up the height, you can see it only appears in the render. If we switch to the shaded view, you can clearly see that the bump layer did not affect polygons. The better method would be to use a displacement object and create a similar effect like this. We will go into greater detail on how to do this in the advanced modeling episode. So when you begin modeling, think in grayscale and only use textures on materials to render out an example. You can use colored materials for different objects as a reference if you are printing in colors. The next thing to consider is the project scale and project settings. When you open a new file in Cinema 4D, the first thing you should always set is the project scale. Down here in the lower right-hand corner is your project settings. You can also use the shortcut of Command or Control D, depending on your operating system. Click on the drop-out menu and select millimeters, since this is the universal measuring system for 3D printing. You should always set this with every file you create in Cinema 4D. Also, to make things easier while modeling, you should set your preferences to millimeters. To do this, go to the Edit menu, scroll down to Preferences, or use the shortcut Command Control E. In here, select the Units section, and click on the drop-down menu and select millimeters. And then you can close this menu. These settings in the preferences will be set throughout the application's menus. There are a few more issues to consider, such as creating watertight geometry and how to identify geometry issues, but we'll cover those as we move along and show solutions to these common problems and ways to avoid them as you model. Now let's move on to the interface of Cinema 4D. If this is the first time using Cinema 4D, don't let this workspace intimidate you. The application is quite easy to use. Let's start at the top of the application window. You will see the usual menus here along the top of the interface. In these menus, you'll find all the different creation tools and more detailed creation and editing tools. But most of these are represented in icon format just below these menus. Starting from the left, these two icons are your undo and redo button. Next to those icons for your move, scale, and rotate tools. If you hover over each tool, it also gives you the shortcut key to activate the tool quickly. Next up are your world movement parameters. These restrict movement of objects to a certain axis. When we model, we want to be able to freeform our creations, and these will come in handy in certain situations. But for now, make sure that X, Y, and Z are all selected. The next set of icons are mainly for rendering. The only parameter we should set up is a location to render out images should we need to use them. By clicking this third button, we can set up our save location. In the Save menu, click on the three-dot Location menu and create a render folder in the same folder as your main file you save for your images. In model building, these other settings are useful for animation and such, but we really won't need to change anything here for this episode. The next set of icons will be doing most of our modeling work. Starting with the cube icon, if you click and hold, it reveals a full set of default primitive items you can select and bring to the workspace instantly by just hovering over them and releasing the mouse button. These make modeling easy, and the parameters are fully adjustable for each object until we make it editable for sculpting and advanced modeling. The next icon is the spline menus. These are used in conjunction with the icon next to it, which contains the generator objects. We will use these to extrude, loft, or you can even create your own splines for advanced modeling techniques and animation paths, and even much more. We will go over how to use these in the next episode, but for now, this is what these icons represent, and that's what's in the menus. The next icon represents the modeling objects. We will be using these quite often in the advanced modeling episode. In this menu, we'll find our connect and our bool objects. These will be used the most, and I will explain how these work in the advanced modeling episode also. Next to the modeling objects is the deformer object menu. In here, we will find some really useful tools when modeling like bend, displacer, and taper. We will go into great detail on these deformer objects in the advanced modeling episode. The last three icons represent objects usually only used in rendering, visual effects, and motion graphics. Should we need to use any of these, we'll go over them as we go. On to navigation. To navigate around in your Cinema 4D project window, we'll use these basic icons that represent the way the default camera sees the stage and how to move the default camera around objects on the stage. The first icon is for moving the camera up, down, left, and right. If you click and hold with the left mouse button and drag the mouse, your default camera will move around. The next icon is your dolly camera tool. By clicking and holding and dragging forward and backward, you will dolly the default camera in and out. Next is the default camera rotation tool. The same applies. Click, hold, and drag your mouse around to rotate the default camera. Finally is the Orthographic View button. By clicking once on this icon, the workspace will expand to show all the views, perspective, top, front, and right. By clicking the same icon in each view, you'll expand this view to full, and by clicking again, resets to the 4 view. You can also access this function using your mouse. Should you have a 3 button or 2 button with a scroll wheel? By clicking the scroll wheel on the background of each window, it does the same operation. Clicking again returns to the previous view, clicking each window expands the view, and clicking again returns to the view to home. These little icons appear in all the orthographic views to make navigation easy. Moving to the left side of the interface, this row of icons along this side represents different modes for moving and selecting, with the most important of the tools right here on top. This icon will change between model and world mode when you scale an object. Here, let me show you how that works by adding a simple cube object to the stage. If I select our transform tool, or hit the T key on the keyboard to switch to that tool, and roll over an axis handle, it turns white. That means this is the axis I want to scale the cube. So if I click and hold and drag my mouse, in model mode, it scales in all directions. If I switch to object mode, it scales only on the axis I have selected. This is a very handy tool, and we'll use this quite often in advanced modeling. The next two icons represent the texture and the work plane mode. We won't be using either of these. After that are the different selection modes you can use on an object, once it is editable, of course. For instance, to make an object editable, select the object in the Objects menu and hit the C key on the keyboard, or you can use this icon here in the top left corner. Once editable, you can select different aspects of this object like points, edges, and polygons to reshape your object. We'll use these modes quite often in the advanced modeling. Moving to the bottom of the interface, starting on the left, is your Materials menu. As I showed you earlier, it is easy to begin creating materials. I usually only create a basic gray material for my models. I may choose to color some objects of a multi-part build just to differentiate the objects, but mostly the default material on objects we are creating will be sufficient. Next to the Materials area is the Coordinates and Scale menu for objects on the stage. These are for manipulating the object in the world or on the stage. Some of these attributes also can be accessed from the Attributes menu for the object selected, which is right here. This is the main Attributes menu for all items listed above in the Objects menu. These two menus work together like this. If we quickly add a cube object, you can see it appears in the Objects menu. If we select it, the Attributes menu will show you all the information about this object, such as size, how many segments, and if we want to add a fillet edge to it, and other basic information about the object selected. If you have the default layout in Cinema 4D, under the Objects menu along the right-hand side should be tabs to quickly access the other commonly used menus, and most importantly, the Content Browser under the Objects menu, and underneath the Attributes menu, you should see the Layers menu tab. If it's not there, you can go up to Window and scroll down to Layers to have it appear. You can just click on the tabs to bring the menus forward. Well, that covers interface basics. We'll go into greater detail on the functions in our advanced modeling episode. The next step is to create a template of our printer's build space so we can model accordingly in Cinema 4D and not have models that exceed our print area. To do this, we are going to create a simple cube object by clicking once on the cube icon. This will drop a 200mm squared cube onto the stage. Let's rename the cube by double-clicking its name in the Objects menu and call it Print Area. If we make sure the object is selected in the Objects menu and move down to the Attributes menu, we can adjust our size to match our printer's build space. Since I am using a Gmax 1.5 XT+, my build area is quite large. So for my printer, I will enter 400 for the X, only 500 for the Y, and 400 for the Z. Now these access may seem different than your printer's accesses, but this is real-world 3D environment modeling, so these are correct. Every printer is different, so make sure you check your printer's manufacturer's documentation for the correct size of your print's build area. Once we have the size set up, we need to put the base of the cube we created flat on the floor of the stage. The easiest way to do that is by using the position settings down here. If we take the Y dimension of our object, in this case the cube, and divide it in half, and enter that number here in the Y position field and hit enter, it will move the object to sit flat on the stage. So in my case, I would enter 250 in the Y and hit enter. Now the cube is sitting right on the floor of the stage. If we hit the shortcut key of S on your keyboard, that will center up the selected object in the viewport window. Keep this shortcut handy because we'll use this quite often in modeling. Next, we need to make this somewhat transparent, and Cinema 4D has a built-in function just for that called X-ray. To use this mode, select the cube in the Objects menu and move down to the Attributes menu, and then click on this Basic tab here. In there at the bottom is the button for the X-ray mode. Select that and the cube will become slightly transparent on the stage. Now we need to lock down this cube so we don't move the object or change its size. The simplest way to do this is to add the cube to a layer and lock the layer. Along the right side here next to the Attributes menu, you should see the tab for Layers. If it is not there, you can access it from the Windows menu. Once you have the Layers menu open and the object selected in the Objects menu, go to the File menu within the Layers menu and select New Layer from Object Selection. This will create a new layer with the cube object in it. You can rename this layer by double-clicking its name, and we'll call it Print Area. Next to the name is a row of icons that represent the different functions of the layer menu. The only one we want to be concerned with now is L for lock. Just under the L row, click on the lock icon to lock this layer permanently in the document. Now we can save this file as a template file that we open and save every time we want to model in Cinema 4D. Although Cinema 4D doesn't have a template format, if you name it properly, you will know it's your template. Just remember to save as when you do open this file. And remember, we already set up the project settings, so it should be in the right scale for every time you use it. Alright, so let's move on to creating a simple cube object and show you how to work with objects in Cinema 4D. To create a basic cube, as we did before, just click on the cube icon once to drop a base cube object onto the stage. If you go over to the Objects menu, you can see it listed here. Below the Objects menu is the Attributes menu and the parameters for this cube. As you can see, the default cube is 200mm squared. Say we want to make a test cube for printing out new filaments or testing our printer, or even calibrating. Let's make this one 40mm. Let's enter the size we want in all the XY fields for the cube in the Attributes menu, and you can tab through these fields quickly after you enter your numbers. We won't be adding any additional segments or creating extra polygons, since this is a perfectly cubed object and doesn't require any extra detail since each side is one single polygon. Now let's move the cube to be flat on the floor of the stage. Remember, we can do that by dividing the Y size in half and entering it into the Y position like so. Now we have our test cube. Remember to use the shortcut key S to center up the cube in the viewport. To move the cube object around, we'll use the first set of tools in the toolbar at the top here. But we'll use the shortcut keys to access those functions. First is the Move tool. By tapping the E key on your keyboard, that will bring up the world movement handles on the cube on the stage. These are color-coded to help you define which axis you want to move the object. If you mouse over an arrowed handle on the object on the stage, the color will turn white when you're using that axis, like so. You can then move the object by clicking and holding, and then move along that axis, and it won't move in any other direction as long as you're moving just the selected axis handle. You can do world movement by just clicking and holding around the cube and not selecting any handles like this, but I advise against that in modeling. Next up is the Transform or Scale tool. Hitting T on your keyboard will access this function. The same applies. If you mouse over a handle, it will scale in that direction only, and in this mode, we scale proportionally along that axis in both directions. If you wish to freeform scale an object, just click outside the object handles and click and drag your mouse to scale in all directions. Again, I don't suggest using this method when modeling, as you will likely want to restrain the movement to an axis. Finally up is the rotation tool. You can use the keyboard shortcut R to access this tool. It functions just like the others. Mouse over a handle and it highlights white. Click and drag to rotate. You can also hold down the Shift key and rotate in increments of 10 degrees. That covers the basic tools on moving, scaling, and rotating an object. Now we can export our file for 3D printing. But before we export this file to STL format, which is native in Cinema 4D, first we have to delete our template. Simply bring up the Layers menu, click the lock icon you clicked previously to unlock the layer. Then move up to the Objects menu and delete the cube named Print Area. Now you can go to the File menu at the top here, scroll down to Export, and select STL from the list of formats. You'll be prompted to give it a location, and if you wish to rename it. This is where you can do that. The next window will prompt you to set the scale. Since we work in millimeters, make sure that is selected with a scale of 1. Now we take the STL file over to Slicer, and we can see that the cube is 40 millimeters square and solid. Well, there you have it. You've created your first model in Cinema 4D and exported it to STL format, and it's ready for slicing and printing. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode of Cinema 4D for 3D printing. We're covering the basics in this one. On the next episode, we're going to go into some advanced modeling techniques and build our first model. So thank you for watching Cinema 4D for 3D printing here on the Print 3D channel. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, comment and like on those videos, and join me again on the next installment of Cinema 4D for 3D printing.